Everyone. Welcome to the HUMA Book Launch Seminar Series. This is a space for discussing critical work that engages HUMA's significant research on artificial intelligence, what it means to be human in Africa today, and also the frontiers that tie technology to the human experience. My name is Amina Suleimani, and I'm a doctoral research fellow at HUMA. And I want to welcome you all on behalf of my colleagues, Azza Mustafa and Minentlin Kube, with whom this seminar is co-organized, as well as on behalf of our director, Divine Fu. So today I'm really delighted to have with me Dr. Ariane Hanemaayer, editor of the book that we're discussing today, Artificial Intelligence and its Discontent, Critiques from the Social Sciences and Humanities, published this year by Palgraf Macmillan. And I also want to welcome one of the contributors to the book, Dr. Stephanie Ullman. So I want to quickly begin with introducing Dr. Hanemaayer and Dr. Stephanie Ullman. Dr. Ariane is an associate professor at Brandon University and a visiting scholar at EGENIS, Center for the Study of the Life Sciences at the University of Exeter. Ariane's research investigates the relationships among medical knowledge, healthcare systems and spaces, algorithmic decision-making technology, and medical governance and regulation. Ariane has written 2 books, The Impossible Clinic, Critical Sociology of Evidence-Based Medicine, and Governing the Impossible System, A Critical Sociology of Public Health Policy. And she's edited 2 anthologies, Artificial Intelligence and Its Content, the book we're discussing today. And the second book that she's edited is The Public Sociology Debate, Ethics and Engagement. Dr. Stephanie Ullman is a postdoctoral research associate on the project Giving Voice to Digital Democracies, the Social Impact of Artificially Intelligent Communication Technology at the Center for Research in the Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities, CRASH, at the University of Cambridge. Stephanie studied English linguistics and web technology at the University of Marburg, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, in Germany. She's completed her PhD in linguistics, focusing on a critical corpus-assisted study of media and political coverage of the 2011 Arab Spring revolutions. To be honest, I had to shorten the biographies of our guests, so I do invite you all to read their extensive biographies in the event page of our website. So we're honestly really looking forward to hear from both Ariane and Stephanie about this book, which actually draws on a range of critical approaches across the social sciences and humanities, including post-humanism, ethics and human values, media and communication, linguistics, governance and justice studies, surveillance studies, Black feminism, and social and political resistance. So Ariane, the first sentence of the introduction to the book is, and I quote, "On what basis can we challenge artificial intelligence?" And I believe many of us here at HUMA working on the 4th Industrial Revolution on the continent and the future of technology and the future of human life and what it means to be human have also been, asking this question ever since we've started our projects. And I think there's so many intersections that we want to think with you today, and we're really delighted that you've both accepted our invitation. So thank you very much. And I just want to quickly say that we will first hear from Ariane and Stephanie before opening it up for a Q&A towards the end. So without further ado, Ariane, I'll hand it over to you, and thank you once more.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And thank you so much for inviting us to be here. This is absolutely such a pleasure and really a privilege to be able to come to such an amazing and diverse center to talk about this amazing work that actually came together over the pandemic. So in some ways, it's like a bit of a past, blur of time that brought all of these amazing humans together to this project. So I just want to start with something that's, really, I think, quite fascinating about the book, which is that the cover of the book is an image created by an AI. So it was gifted to the project, to this book project, by Art AI, which is like kind of like the first, as I understand it, bespoke AI generator. It's been around for a while now, and I thought it would just be like a really nice image to kind of really capture some of the questions, the kind of infusion of AI that we're seeing in our cultural artifacts and in our books. So just to kind of let you know how this is going to go, Amina has been incredibly gracious in letting us, in a sense, kind of push some of the kind of format boundaries that people might be used to. So I'm going to start with this kind of like framing some of the anthology themes and what I tried to think about as what unifies the anthology. Then I'm going to hand it over to Stephanie, who's going to talk about her contribution to the volume. Then the two of us are going to have a little kind of back and forth discussion before we open it up to all of you here. So really, really happy to have everyone to come along for this. So I'm really glad that Amina started us with the kind of guiding question, which is the first question of the book, which is like, on what basis can we challenge artificial intelligence, its infusion, its investment and implementation across the globe? And so the book kind of starts from recognizing, in a sense, a need to write AI's story from the views, approaches, perspectives, conceptual analysis that's given to us from the human sciences and the humanities. And I think that, you know, we might be able to kind of agree that so far, predominantly, when we think about whether it's popular representations or even, you know, in kind of computing science and engineering, it's the developers who have kind of told a particular type of story about AI, right? Thinking about, you know, it's periods of investment, or it's winters, it's technological kind of overcoming, you know, the heroism of and innovation of different thinkers in the field over time. So this book for me was kind of an opportunity to think a little bit about what the humanities and social sciences could offer to this discussion. And what I saw that as being is really the unique perspectives that can, we hope, shift the conversation in a way. And it's through those array of approaches and critical methods, which I'm going to talk a little bit about in the book. So the book kind of starts from a kind of standpoint that was really well articulated in the literature only last year by Shunryu Kallingarvi, who's also a contributor in the book. And he, as I saw it, kind of revitalized the field of AI dissent through the recovery of the work of Mortimer Taub. And this, of course, is kind of signaling that there's a long history of AI criticism from within the field of AI development. And Taub was really a part of that story. He was a researcher at the Library of Congress in the US, and he believed that the premise of AI was based on a kind of false promise, like the idea that the human mind is like a machine. And because of that, it would eventually be possible to replicate a human mind in a machine in some way, shape, or form. And so he thought this was a kind of marketing ploy. He wrote a book in 1961 about this and kind of made it his personal mission to debunk this myth in his lifetime. So in some ways, our goal of the anthology is related to this kind of long history insofar as we're trying to connect and extend this work of questioning those underlying principles or values upon which AI development, infusion, and proliferation is based, but also trying to argue for the establishment of a kind of interdisciplinary subfield, or a kind of unified way of thinking about what AI critique is and what it can be. And so I start from kind of this idea that for all of the contributors and all of the approaches is that they kind of start from this idea that AI is meant to solve certain types of problems, and they're often quite commonly social problems or human problems. And so especially salient is the way that AI or machine learning is like this technological fix, right? And some of the chapters in this volume make this really quite clear. For example, you know, the work of Saheli Dada-Burton thinks about this in medical institutions, and Wang and Tian think about this in judicial institutions. In medicine, Dada-Burton shows us that AI was designed to resolve issues related to the coordination and administering of therapeutic treatment in hard-to-reach places, So there's like this dream, this goal, this promise that AI and nanorobots will be able to solve this technological problem. And in the Chinese context, Wang and Tian show us about these kinds of coordinated justice decisions in an overwhelmed system where AI is meant to solve certain inefficiencies or other kinds of issues that have been brought up in that particular institutional context. So in all of these areas, we're kind of thinking about how AI is increasingly being infused in our institutions under this kind of promise or justification of improving an aspect of social life. So before I hand it over to Stephanie, I just wanted to kind of offer a snapshot of some kind of, in a sense, guiding principles that I see as running throughout this kind of unified field as reflected in the contributions and chapters of the anthology. And in many ways, I've grounded it in a kind of Frankfurt School or like kind of critical theory way, insofar as we're thinking about the practice of critique from different perspectives. So the first kind of way that I've thought about this is that the goal of AI criticism need not be fixing problems. It doesn't have to have a technical goal. It's not that the basis upon which that we're critiquing it is to somehow, overcome issues for developers in the past, but also to raise valuable questions about the nature of what AI is meant to do or solve. And that's exactly bringing us to number 2, which is seeking to understand the nature of the problem that AI is meant to solve, right? Like, what is so problematic? How is it that AI, it takes that problem as kind of ipso facto something that just is, that needs to be solved technologically, and instead trying to unpack what those underlying assumptions are, whether something is problematic, how it might have a social, historical, cultural significance in its definition. And I think the work of Kat Sinclair in the book does a really nice way of highlighting the kind of underlying historical issues about labor time for which AI is designed to solve in her case analysis, and instead trying to think about the conditions of labor in society that really raise this issue, rather than just thinking about, oh, we need to make labor more efficient and add different kinds of AI or robotic technologies. And lastly is the third aim, which is, as very much kind of building on a Marxian 11th thesis kind of idea, that it's to interpret, to build understanding about how we got to now, how AI are being designed, how machine learning is being developed, but also with this kind of emancipatory goal that reaches beyond this kind of understanding. So as it's already been covered by Amina, these are the kind of general themes under which the collection is organized. It's a range of topics, but also I want to highlight that, beyond just the two of you here today, there's also a diverse range of authors that represent vast geographies, including the global South. And it goes kind of beyond a more, North American or Eurocentric way of thinking about the infusion and development of AI. And I think readers will really enjoy this book. It has so many great examples, like automated justice in China, like I've discussed, also COVID-19 health apps in India, the role of AI in app upgrades and the internet, how AI is used in labor and robotics, how bioethics has informed AI frameworks, how AI challenges our understandings of labor and child-adult relations, and also the kind of ways that language get used in Google Translate and different kinds of algorithmic ways of doing language translation. I think that's a really nice place for me to kind of stop and pass it over to Stephanie, our contributor, who talked exactly about this.
Yes, thank you so much, Ariane. I just read the question that Divine posted in the chat, which was, how do we actually define AI? And I think I'm going to start with that, because that is a really good question. One that we've also talked about a lot in our project. And yeah, so I think AI, I would define very broadly. So that can be technically anything that is based on computational methods to model kind of human skills or human intelligence. But I also have to point out that when when we talk about AI as part of our project, Giving Voice to Digital Democracies, we have particularly looked at artificial intelligence that is language-based. So any kind of model or system that can be grouped under the heading communications technology. So that can be voice agents on your smartphone or Alexa, but also things like social media and, for example, the use of hate speech in social media. Yeah, so but in my chapter that I contributed to this book, can we go to the next slide? Yeah, so what I focused on in my chapter was actually machine translation, and specifically the occurrence of gender bias in neural machine translation systems, just such as Google Translate. We focused on gender bias for now because it is extremely hard to focus on several forms of bias at the same time. So we basically started by looking at gender bias. Yeah, and I basically want to start with looking at the problem as such. Why is it a problem and how does it come to exist? So languages have different grammatical genders. You may know this if you maybe speak more than one language, and if you've ever learned a second language. In most cases, we have forms, we distinguish between a feminine, a masculine, and a neuter form. And in some other languages, there are even more forms. So we focus specifically on translation pairs from English and German. We use the data set of altogether over 17 million language pairs. English and German is an interesting combination because if you want to translate a sentence like the nurse called the doctor, as you see in the slide, into German, you have to make choices with regard to the gender of the person you're referring to. So for both nurse and doctor, you can have male and female forms. And actually the screenshot you can see here on the slide illustrating the German translation of it, from which I took from Google Translate. The default translation is female for nurse and male for doctor. And this is actually the case in a lot of translation pairs where you have grammatical gender and it is inflected on the noun. So this is, of course, problematic because this kind of reinforces very old, outdated stereotypes, because it is, of course, not the case that all doctors are male and all nurses are female. So how does this problem actually come to exist then? And this has to do with the training data, essentially, because for most automated systems today, the way that training data is obtained is by crawling the web, essentially, in this case for text, and just get any kind of text that is available without really looking in detail into it. And we know that the internet is not a balanced and fair space. So you can imagine any kind of biases and imbalances that are inherent in the training data will eventually also manifest in the output of the system, which we also saw here. And this table you can see on the slide here is just an illustration of the corpus analysis I performed on our training data set before we actually trained a system, to just see what are the numbers, what are the representations of male and female forms. And you can see that almost all cases, or in almost all cases, the numbers are skewed, in most cases towards the male, but in some also towards the female. But the female is usually easily explained due to the nature of the language or due to the nature of the training data set. So for example, we have a really high number of wife, which can be explained easily because we saw that a lot of the training data is actually biblical text. And especially in German, the the word that is used for woman is Weib, which then explains the very high number of woman related or female related words. But other than that, it's mostly skewed towards the male. Next slide, please. Yes, and here you can actually see some of the translation pairs we looked at in more detail, and we focused on profession terms here, and admittedly also professions that are usually stereotypically either male or female, such as doctor, politician, nurse. And here we can also see that in most cases, doctor, architect, engineer, physicist, these are all skewed strongly towards the male form. Nurse is the only one that is actually skewed towards the female form, although I would have to admit in this case that nurse is altogether rather unrepresented or underrepresented in the data set. So the difference isn't as huge as maybe with regard to the German forms of doctor. Next slide. So I guess the most important question is, what do we do with this? Can we actually completely debias a machine translation system? And should that actually be the goal? Should we get rid of all biases? And we have to acknowledge, of course, that certain skewings are actually representative of a population. So certain things, for example, medical conditions, affect men or people who were born biologically as men are affected more often than female, or the other way around. So it's not automatically a negative bias, but of course, if it is not representative of a general population, it can lead to systematic biases and inequalities. And one important question is, of course, what do we aim for? Is it more technological realism or technological utopianism? So do we want our systems to be modeled on real life? Do we want them to reflect real numbers and real distributions? Or do we maybe even want our AI systems or machine translation systems to be ethically superior in a way, and to teach us about what would be ethically more correct? So I guess that's an interesting question that we could maybe have a discussion on. But just speaking in terms of technology and what is actually possible, so it would be impossible and infeasible to actually manually debias a training data set for a machine translation system. Technologically, so using automated methods, it would be possible. And we tested out different methods before and after the actual training of the system. So that's the next slide. So here you can see basically what we did, the different kind of methods we used to try and remove bias before we actually trained the system. So we applied 3 different methods: downsampling, upsampling, and counterfactual augmentation. So downsampling basically means that we got rid of all kind of imbalanced forms until we had like a balanced number of female and male forms in both data sets, German and English. And kind of the opposite is the case for upsampling. So we add or duplicate data automatically until we reach a balanced number of terms, gender terms for both languages. And then we have counterfactual augmentation, which means that basically if one data set contains a sentence like she is a doctor, but it doesn't contain a sentence that says he is a doctor, we add all of these sentences to make it even, basically. So all of these attempts basically failed. I can already say that much. That wasn't really very successful, and it has a lot to do with the differences in the languages and the complexities, but basically none of these attempts were really promising or had promising results. So something else that we tried was actually removing bias after training the data set on the large data set that had over 17 million words or sentence pairs. So we tried a technique, a fine-tuning technique. So we created an additional data set that is very, very small in comparison to the entire training data set, but a data set that was completely gender balanced. So there were no biases in that data set, and it only contained 388 sentence pairs. So sentences, very simple sentences like the tall woman finished her work. We used this tiny data set to retrain the system and to fine tune it to make it more sensitive or more aware of any kind of gender related biases. And this actually turned out to work really well. So with this method, we actually were able to remove bias from the system. Okay, and final slide, I think, I hope. Yes, and finally, I just want to point out that this was what basically made this research possible, is that we work together interdisciplinarily. And I want to strengthen that. And I think it's really important also in the context of this book, because it shows really well that if different disciplines work together on a problem, we can get really great results. And so we work together with people from philosophy or AI ethics who kind of provided the criticism, the theoretical foundation for the whole to approach the problem. Then my role as a linguist was basically performing analyses of the training data and looking at how gender is realized in both of these data sets, where do the biases exist. And then eventually we worked together with a PhD student in information engineering who did all the experiments and tried all the different methods to see what works and what doesn't. So yeah, I'm going to end with this and just stress how important it is for this kind of work to really work together. Yeah, and I think we're going to move on now to have a little discussion about this. So if I'm going to go back to you, Ariane, can you tell us a bit more about how the book came together in the first place? Like, how did it all start, basically?
Yeah, thank you. I'm really glad to hear you contextualize the project in the PowerPoint slide that you gave as well. It's gave me so many things to think about. But to your question, yeah, the book came together kind of like serendipitously, actually. When I was a visiting scholar at Crash, there with you, I recognized the background of your office there. A call for papers just came across my desk from Shunryu Garvey, who was putting together this interdisciplinary science review special issue. And so, at the time I had this folder, as a lot of us do, kind of on the back burner of our desktop, where you keep ideas for things that maybe someday you'll actually work on. And so I had this folder about critiques of AI in medicine, or rather just algorithmic decision-making assistant technologies in medicine. And so I proposed something to Shunryu, and when he got over 60 different, proposals for this special issue, and I kind of approached him and said, well, maybe we should also do a collected volume with what you've put together. So really it was kind of Shunryu's idea, but then eventually I ended up taking leadership of the anthology while he oversaw the publication of the special issue. So like I said, it was actually quite serendipitous that we were able to kind of find different outlets for so many people. He got over 60 responses to the call for papers. So it was really clear that so many people were really thinking about this problem, about kind of like critiques and AI and machine learning, machine translation systems, you know, the very kind of broad umbrella for what that term can possibly mean. So that's, yes, it was really a serendipitous project to be able to start to think about some of the things that were in that recess, in a sense, of my back burner. And of course, all of that happening at Crash, which kind of leads me to something I wanted to ask you about, Stephanie, because you know, you're working on this Giving Voice to Digital Democracies project at Crash. And so, of course, you've presented the work you've done with machine learning, but then you've also done a lot of really more modern kind of contemporary questions to do with counter speech. And I was just curious if you wanted to tell us a bit more. Like, you've talked about kind of thinking about bias, but also thinking about counter speech. And so, yeah, I was really interested to hear a bit more about whether this work connects to what you're trying to do now in this kind of more like kind of politically and ethically oriented project.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say they kind of both address a similar problem, but at different stages, maybe. I would say that, of course, if you encounter bias in the machine translation set, it might not directly have any effects, but it will kind of slowly seep into people's perceptions, if that makes sense, and kind of and lead to biases and lead to prejudices, or strengthen them. And gender bias is really just one example, of course. And yeah, and what we see in the end, like at its worst, or the worst outcome of these stereotypes and prejudices is, of course, things like hate speech, which can be sexist hate speech, but also takes a lot of different forms. And so we've also been looking at hate speech detection and what do we actually do with it when it's out there, because at this point, it's really, we don't have a perfect solution to prevent it. So the question is, how do we actually counter it, I suppose? Pun not intended, but also kind of. Yeah, so I've looked a lot at counter speech in the past year, and how we can potentially automate counter speech, which is improving. But I'm also looking at sort of like a human in the loop scenarios, because I believe that, my personal opinion, an automated system can never be as good as a human being in really producing valuable and appropriate defenses for people and counter speech to speak up against hate. So yeah, going back to the book though, is there anything, if you look back now, when you looked at the different or read the different chapters, that kind of stood out to you or surprised you particularly?
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, thanks. This project was really surprising at like every stage. You know, not just for the fact that so many of the authors were like living and writing during a pandemic, and I just really wanted to showcase that, because it was really like such a strong dedication from the authors to really think through these bigger questions, while also having all these different demands on their lives and their work. So in some ways it was kind of like, you know, a real admiration, like a kind of surprise that so many people were so committed to this. Like, it was a really timely project and really interesting. But more specifically, I think, you know, some of the things that I found, like, this was one of the coolest projects that I've edited in my career so far, just because of all of the things I got to learn about, you know, like, I had kind of like my own understanding about, you know, AI, machine learning, algorithmic technologies in medicine. But then there was just all of these other kind of areas. Like one of the things I found really surprising was learning, and I mentioned it in my presentation, like learning about automated judgments in the kind of Chinese legal justice system. And I was just like, wow, that sounds, almost like it's out of a sci-fi novel that I've read, and kind of thinking about what that might mean, societally or culturally, and how some of those questions are in related to governance, but also in related to like our lives. And so that was like a really surprising element to me. Another one that I thought and I'll just leave it with just two kind of surprises, but one was about the kind of anthropomorphizing of our kind of like, the voice, as you referred to it earlier when you were talking about like Alexa, and Scott Schwartz like wrote this like really interesting, piece about how anthropomorphizing these kinds of voices like our Siri is a different way of thinking about our responsibility in our worlds. And that really kind of challenged the ways that I was thinking about how, as technology appears more and more intelligent, it also has changed the way that we think about who's responsible for the wrong turn I made. Oh, it was Google, the map took me in the wrong direction, or who was responsible for my gender bias in my translation? Oh, it was Google, and so he points out this like really interesting juxtaposition that kind of happens as we shift over time. And so that was also a really exciting thing for me to think about. But on that topic of things that I've kind of learned from doing this project, and you brought it up right at the end of your presentation, which was like perfectly timed. But, before we open it up to questions, I would really love to hear maybe, thinking interdisciplinary, right? Being on a team that's interdisciplinary. Like, do you have lessons or advice for those of us, for other humanists who are hoping to not only use like those great, like kind of, critical tools in our toolbox, but also how to bring those to those interdisciplinary conversations, like how to work with engineers, people in machine learning, or similar collaborations in STEM. Like, I would really love to hear if you have any kind of like takeaways that might be, fruitful for others.
Yeah. That's really interesting. And I think I'm going to just start by saying I almost think it's inevitable and it's really important if we want to approach these concepts, because I think, as you mentioned in your presentation, we have to get away from the perspective that the designers of these systems kind of, I'm kind of torn. I don't expect people who are engineers and computer scientists to know everything about the languages that they program Google Translate for. But at the same time, I think the least that we should do today is then maybe get linguists and get social scientists and philosophers to get their input, because it's impossible for one person to know it all. And I found it to be really fruitful and really interesting to work with engineers and computer scientists. And I would just say open-mindedness. It sounds really simple, but I feel like I was afraid at the beginning, because I thought, oh, I don't know enough about coding and the mathematical background. But then it's like I noticed they don't know what I know about linguistics. So it's like a win-win for both, basically. So I think it's hugely important, and we should just be open-minded and do it more. It's very simple.
Yeah, I really love that. And it's like, like just in my own experience now, trying to think with people who have, who are trying to design like precision health AI to look for patterns, or, look for regularities and biomarkers, like trying to reach those folks, like in my own work, like I find it like a huge hurdle to try to like get them. It's like they know that societal impact is important. And so they're like, oh, who knows about that? Oh, it's the social scientists and the humanists. But then when you kind of like meet them at the table, and there's sometimes like this like real reluctance to kind of go, kind of cross that, I think sometimes people call it epistemic risk, like the idea that you actually aren't an expert. And so you need to rely on someone else's expertise. But when we're talking about, millions of dollars on the table, or, trying to think about things in really concrete terms, like when you're talking about coding, for example, right? Mm-hmm. Like it's sometimes like ships in the night, in the conversation, but at the same time, it's like it's so important to have that kind of like willingness of the team, I think, to be willing to cross that chasm of epistemic risk, So, yeah, I just wanted to add that onto the end. Yeah,
No, it's really important. And also, we don't need to be experts in everything. So I think that's okay. And that should be communicated to everyone.
Yeah, definitely. I think, though, we could hand it back over to you, Amina. Thank you so much for letting us just kind of, share our thoughts and our perspectives and to dialogue a bit about this. We're really looking forward to, any questions that you or others might have.
No, thank you so much for this really rich presentation. And I really appreciated the last point on multidisciplinary work, but how often when we are part of the table, it's not the assumption is not what we won't be on an equal footing by virtue of who deems their discipline superior to others, especially when it comes to STEM or medicine. But I have a question, and I want to use my privilege as a chair to ask the first question and then move on to my colleague Chikezi's question. And it's really about, the term discontent. And I know you've explained it in the introduction to the book. And I was really curious about, what is the starting point of discontent, and how can discontent be heard in these multidisciplinary spaces and still allow the point of view from the social sciences and the humanities to sit with grace and be considered. And also there was the question of what is AI, Divine's question, if you'd also like to respond to it, Ariane, and then we'll move to my colleague Chikezi's question. Thank you.
Oh yeah, thank you. I think Stephanie really summarized that quite lovely, in a quite lovely way, because I think that there's a number of different ways that we can think about artificial intelligence, right? It can be about artificial neural networks, could be algorithmic models. It could even be, the kind of more ideal type kind of singularity, representations that we see in whether it be like science fiction or even sometimes in grant promises, right? Like that we're going to develop these kinds of systems that will, be able to set their own tasks or define for themselves certain outputs after their learning. So, I mean, it's meant to be quite broad, because I think the ways that resistance or reluctance or discontent they're circulating in a number of these different spheres, and coming from different standpoints, be they the standpoints of the users. I think Laura Shallin's, Black feminist thought and critiques of emerging technologies, her chapter in the book tries to think really seriously about really the standpoint of the populations who are affected by different types of, say, facial recognition technologies, and really kind of thinking about not only the tactics, but what one can do as they think about what that means for their lives. So I think that was So I think that's really an important thing to highlight about the book. Yeah, discontent is an interesting word, right? Because it suggests a dissatisfaction, right? Which kind of seems like it's like a negative, potentially negative or unhappy connotation. But as we kind of like suss it out in the work and in the chapters, it can be anything from, as Avon Huxer puts it, like a cautious word from a friend, like as a developer who's also done this kind of more media analysis. Like for him, he thinks about it as a very friendly caution. Whereas, for someone like, Shunryu, his chapter in the volume is really like, AI is what's wrong with the internet, like he's writing a manifesto, right? So there's a large range of thinking about not only hesitation, reluctance, these kinds of questioning concerns, or resistance to, right? So it's really meant to be a kind of broad umbrella that's supposed to kind of capture a certain type of spirit of the worries, and also how to conceptualize those worries and how to bring those worries into the conversation in a way that isn't subject to the framework that we tend to be grappling with, which is this kind of technological one where the problem gets defined in a very technological way. And then it seems like downstream are the only ways that we really, and I'm of course really broad stroke, right? When I say we, really thinking about kind of the broader kind of areas of criticism that I'm trying to find, connections in what I call this kind of subfield. But it's that it almost seems as if it's like, we'll design this thing, and then, later, if you have something to say about it, we'll consider it. And, that's an oversimplification. But at the same point, it's like trying to bring back into the first stages about how the issues are kind of thought about, and thinking about what those critical tools might be. And so, just to kind of bring it back to Stephanie's point, which is really like finding your interlocutors as well as your collaborators is, I think, a really interesting thing to think about as social scientists, as humanists, as we approach the table and kind of think, who are the people who actually, who have a will to include, right? Who have that, I want to use the word almost like humility in a sense, right? Like, because I think that kind of enables the leap of faith. I'm speaking in metaphors, but not deliberately, but just like how it is that we can think about crossing that chasm of epistemic risk and trying to say, I'm not the expert, and it's like being willing to rethink your own position before you already have the magic bullet solution, which is a new algorithm or a new data set, or whatever kinds of the ways that in a sense these projects get designed. So, I mean, I have so many thoughts about that. I probably haven't fully answered all of those questions, but I want to make sure that Stephanie has time to respond to the questions in the chat as well. But thank you for that. It's something I've been really thinking about a lot, not only since the book, but even before that, in terms of multidisciplinary collaboration. It's exciting, and it's also challenging.
Thank you so much, Ariane. I just want to ask my colleague Chikesi if he wants to ask his question in verbatim, or should we rely on the text in the chat? Chikesi? Okay, I think he says he cannot unmute. So the question to Stephanie is really great summary of your important chapter. How did you and your colleagues measure the degree of success after you recoded the data used for the AI system you worked on? That is, how did you find out that the gender language was improved after your experiment? Thank you.
Yes, that is a good question. The first thing I did was actually post the link to the paper that has a bit more of the technical details. So this is the original paper that my colleagues and I wrote, and also has all the details on the testing and the evaluation that we did. We worked with the WINO-MT challenge by Stanovsky and colleagues, which basically already gives like a kind of framework for comparison. And then, and this is very, very technical, and this is exactly the reason why we had engineers as part of this, we used things like accuracy measures and the Blur score, which is an evaluation metric specifically for translation. So that measures kind of the accuracy of translations. And for this one, for example, it was closest to our baseline system for the counterfactual kind of sample that we created. So that was closest to the original system and performed best next to the tiny data set fine-tuning that we did in the end. So these, I don't know if this sort of answer satisfies the question, but this is just in terms of what we technically did in order to evaluate the results of the system.
thank you so much, Stephanie, for elaborating on the question. I would also just like to invite anyone who has a question to either send it through the chat or use the reaction button at the bottom of the Zoom to ask or to raise their hands. I'm really curious about what you both think of the arguments that I've heard a few times, which is on the question of value and ethics. That, you know, if I'm a good human being, if I'm a good engineer, this will translate into my machine or my algorithm. And I've heard a lot of people contest it. So I'd really love what you guys think about this and what your advice is when, you know, putting in question human ethical values in conversation with the machine.
Do you want me to take a stab at it first?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I know. Well, actually, I wanted to kind of like bring it back to some of the themes that you're, you know, kind of working on, like the relationship between technology and the human experience, right? Like in your introduction to Human in the Center, it's you know, one of the things I think is really interesting about criticism is that there's usually a historical dimension to it, right? Like thinking about why those questions at that time, right? Thinking like questions like, if I'm a good human being, it's under certain criteria or circumstances that are kind of socially defined, right? Otherwise, we're just kind of, I guess, like, you know, it would be almost narcissistic to say I'm a good human being and I have nothing to point to except my own ideas. Yeah, so just, you know, I say that a bit cheeky, but I think that's a really important, you know, point to make, is that, you know, all of the things that we believe are true or just or right are situated at particular points in time and space, and that those things matter, especially when we're thinking about equity projects or inclusion projects now, and how so many of the criticisms actually of AI started from AI resistance movements, and you know, thinking specifically about, you know, even some of the things covered in Laura's chapter around you know, Black feminist resistance. And that, I think, is a really, you know, significant thing to kind of, you know, have this moment where it's like, well, you know, whose lives, whose, you know, values, whose ethics, and how those things get brought in. And that's why we have, you know, these other kinds of frameworks and tools and conceptual ways of thinking about what our values are, of thinking about what kinds of privilege, you know, someone who might be an engineer is versus somebody who would be subject to a technology that, you know, erases their face or picks them out in a crowd, or, you know, like these, you know, all of these like really significant things that are affecting, you know, the human experience as a result of these kinds of systems. So so in some ways it's I think that it can't, you know, it can't be just up to one person. And that's why I kind of talked about your interlocutors, right? It's that none of us know all of our biases. None of us know all of the things that guide us. That's the work of dialogue and, you know, interdisciplinary reflection and critique and analysis. And I think that that's, you know, part of the kind of way that I wanted to present the book to a kind of world of not only humanists and social scientists, but also, you know, those who are open or questioning or exploring from within, right? Like the same way that Taub was in the kind of in the early days of these projects. Anyway, I'll hand it over to Stephanie. It's probably even you know, more down to earth things to say than you know, than my potentially utopian views.
Yeah, I think maybe I can use an example from the hate speech research, because basically I just think that it's impossible to know as an individual, especially with a specific background, like I'm a white woman, how do I know what could be offensive to, for example, a transgender man, a Black transgender man, or like, so we cannot know all the biases and what could be potentially be harmful in a system that we build, even if we're if we're a good person and have all the right values and ethical guidelines. But something, for example, that comes up, or that often comes up in hate speech research, is that even the annotations of the training data sets tend to be biased, because most of the annotators that do this work are white males. And they often, for example, incorrectly label something that is, for example, common slang or common wording in the Black African community. They would label it as hate speech, but it is because they're white, they have no idea. Or even the use of the N-word, you know, which is acceptable within the community, but of course, if I as a white person say it, it is offensive. But of course, if you don't have that background knowledge and you don't have that experience, you're inevitably biased. So yeah, this is why I feel like I say this in every single at every single panel or in every single talk. But there just needs to be more diversity. Like, these data sets cannot just be handled by white people, for example, because yeah, as you said, it's just, we're privileged. We don't know the experiences of other people, and often it will end in such forms of bias.
So can I just jump in? I had a stronger, I'd maybe have been a stronger kind of like point to make, which is like, there's a kind of underlying paternalism, or even like almost like, yeah, I'm just going to leave it there. A kind of paternalism that underlies a kind of idea or a belief that there could be one ultimate objective outside standpoint that would design the perfect machine, or that would design something that could later be the perfect machine, you know. And I think that kind of technologism, or that kind of understanding that something sits over and above rather than within the kind of cultural context, which, you know, Stephanie says, hey, linguistics are really good at pointing out how culture and community, you know, can affect our understanding of language data sets, right? Like, and so there's a kind of, there's a nuance and a kind of vision and perspective that can be brought from the humanities and social sciences that's within rather than outside of. And I think that's, you know, I resist that kind of paternalism when you know, that wouldn't be one of my interlocutors. Someone who says, hey, you know, I'm a good person, I'm going to design the perfect system, I don't need anyone else, you know.
Thank you so much. I think that was really clear and really straightforward. And I think it was a call to action in and of itself, to really try and impose ourselves in these spaces where decision making are taking place when it comes to the kind of algorithms or the kind of technologies that will impact our lives in one way or another. And I think the critique of the perfect machine, or I'm good, hence my machine is good, and the way we stand against it, I feel like it actually speaks to the argument of the book. One of the arguments that I came across, which is that we need to establish an AI discontent subfield. And I had perhaps, if it's possible, to end with this question on how do you envision a subfield of AI discontent to look like or to be, before we wrap up. It's been a really wonderful conversation. I wish we had more time, but thank you for staying with us.
Yeah, of course. You know, it's you know, I'm just one person with one kind of vision, and so it's in some way it's like the material culture of actually making this book, or making, you know, this interdisciplinary special issue that my colleague Shinryu made. You know, it's in some ways there's like that material dimension of like trying to seek out these conversations and put them in these like nicely unified places. So that's one dimension. But I think the other one is the other kind of dimension was just how the kind of critiques have kind of popped up in different points in time, like tied very much to the investment and technological development of AI over time as well. And so they've been kind of scattered, not only across the world, across discipline, but also across time. And so in some ways, it's kind of a kind of invitation, or like a call to try to find those networks, to cite each other, to, you know, have conversation, to encourage that, you know, multidisciplinary, or, you know, I guess some people talk about transdisciplinary kind of conversations across the table. And so, you know, that's kind of, in some ways, you know, those are the kind of practices. But otherwise, just I think the unifying kind of principles that I, you know, tried to think about just in terms of my sample, right? If I'm going to be social scientific about it, my sample being the chapters of the volume, is really kind of thinking about some of those underlying principles, like how do we question, how do we resist, or how do we bring to the table, you know, a new understanding of the problem, or what has been labeled a problem that technology is meant to solve? How do we trouble that kind of thinking in a world that, you know, is increasingly not friendly, you know, to those ways? So it's of thinking, right? You know, doing more with less, austerity, you know, climate crisis, disaster. Like, there's so many pressures that are happening right now. And so I think that it's going to be even more important for us as, you know, again, speaking as a big tent of like humanists and social scientists, to really say, you actually need us because we offer you all of these things that you haven't been able to conceptualize in the ways that you need, to. So yeah, that's kind of my thoughts about it. But I obviously want to invite Stephanie in case she has any kind of closing thoughts about it as well.
I think what's been good is that we've been seeing kind of the establishment, or the I can't think of the word right now, but we've been seeing a lot of programs like AI ethics and data ethics coming into existence at different universities, including here at the University of Cambridge. But also what I think is extremely important and should be implemented into computer science and engineering courses are just mandatory courses on ethics and philosophy, and maybe even social sciences. So basically a course that every single information engineering student or every computer science student has to take in order to think about the potential impact of any system that they might develop at some point. I think that should be as mandatory as it is for a medical student to learn about medical ethics. So yeah.
I was also going to say, and intersectionality, you know, like thinking about, you know, or, you know, critical frameworks, like how the things that we can objectify or design are built upon certain principles, you know, like I was just going to add that to your very cool curriculum suggestion, Stephanie. I think that would be really amazing.
Thank you both so much. I think, yeah, I've heard and I've seen many spaces think about these curriculums for engineers, and it's just really important. As someone who's been doing some field work at an AI lab, it's really interesting how social interactions for social scientists is different from engineers who spend the entire day with arguably non-human technologies. So Stephanie and Ariane, I just want to really thank you for your time and for your generosity presenting to us about the book, and Stephanie about your work as a linguist. It's been truly inspired to listen to it and to also learn about, you know, the possibilities of working along technology-driven engineers. Sorry, English might not be working for me today, but I'm trying my best. To actually transform the ways in which these will have an impact on various communities. I truly believe that the book brings a multi-layered value to our work as social scientists, working on these intersections, as you said, Ariane, of AI, technologies, health, human life, but also trying to think about like what it would mean to decolonize these kind of technologies. I just also want to thank everyone for having joined us today. This has been a HUMA book launch discussion with Ariane Hanemaayer and Stephanie Ullman on their most recently published book, an anthology called Artificial Intelligence and its Discontent, Critiques from the Social Sciences and Humanities. I believe the book is available via Palgrave and Macmillan's platform. So I think that's where you can find it. And I also want to invite all our participants and everyone watching us to join us for our other seminars happening at HUMA this week. There's the Attaya seminar on Thursday, which is perhaps a continuation to today's conversation. We will be having Ziad Borat on digital despotism, natural slavery, and post-colonial perturbations. And next Monday, our HUMA book launch will be with Malak Al-Khel on her book Valse des Silences, as she joins us with Sana Al-Wazn. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a beautiful afternoon.
Thank you so much, Amina.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.